That snowy storm night, I opened the door to let a poor man and his dog take shelter. My son tried to force them away. I didn't listen, and invited them inside. The moment the dog stepped in, it went straight to my son's office door, growling and scratching at it frantically. I opened that door and realized my wife's death wasn't simply from illness. And in that moment I realized everything I had overlooked for months may have been planned all along. Thank you for staying with me. Before we move forward, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to see how far this reaches. Also, some elements in this story are fictional, added for storytelling and educational purposes. Any similarities are unintentional, but the message may still carry meaning for those who listen. The kitchen light had been broken for 3 weeks, and I hadn't bothered to fix it. That probably tells you everything you need to know about where I was at mentally that December. I'm Walter Keene, 71 years old, retired accountant. A man who spent 40 years making sure every number lined up, every column balanced, every loose end got tied off before the weekend. Order wasn't just a habit for me. It was the way I breathed. But since June, I'd stopped fixing things. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, the way I'd been doing most Friday evenings lately. Outside, the wind off Lake Ontario was picking up that particular kind of cold that Watertown does better than anywhere else on Earth. The kind that doesn't just chill you, it gets inside the walls, inside the wood, inside you. The house on County Route 202 had always been alive with sound when Maggie was here. The radio she kept on low while she cooked, her slippers on the hardwood, the way she'd hum something half-remembered while rinsing the dinner dishes. 6 months of silence had turned this place into something I barely recognized. The rooms felt wider somehow, emptier in a way that square footage couldn't explain. Her chair was still at the head of the table. I know I should have moved it. My son had suggested it twice, gently the first time, less gently the second. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. That old pine chair with the faded cushion she'd recovered in blue fabric back in 2009, it still held the shape of her somehow. Still faced the window where she liked to watch the yard in the morning while she drank her tea. Speaking of which, her mug was still on the shelf above the stove, the one with the faded cardinal painted on the side. I hadn't touched it either. I told myself it was because I didn't want to break it. But that wasn't the truth. And on quiet nights like this one, I wasn't in the habit of lying to myself. The truth was, moving things felt like erasing her. I reached for my own mug, plain white, nothing special, and let the warmth seep into my palms. The tea had gone lukewarm. I drank it anyway. She'd tried to tell me something. That thought came back every night without fail. Always around this hour when the house went fully quiet, and there was nothing left to distract me from it. It was 2 days before she passed. She'd been in and out, some moments clear, others not. I was sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, when her fingers tightened around mine with a strength I hadn't expected. Her lips moved. She was trying to say something, and I leaned in, but not close enough. I caught fragments, a word that might have been careful, something that sounded like a name, though I couldn't make it out, and then the moment passed. She closed her eyes. The next time she woke, she didn't try again. I told myself she'd just been confused, that the medication had her mixing up dreams with reality. I told myself a lot of things that summer to get through the days, but in the dark of December, with the wind pressing against the kitchen windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd known something I didn't, that whatever she'd been trying to say wasn't confusion at all. I just hadn't leaned close enough to hear it. Brandon and Serena arrived around 7. My son was 38, broad-shouldered with Maggie's dark eyes and my stubborn jaw. He'd always been good-looking in a way that seemed to open doors for him, a fact he was aware of and used without apology. He worked in finance-managed accounts for a firm up in Syracuse, drove a car that cost more than most people's first homes. He'd done well for himself. Maggie had been proud of him, in the uncomplicated way that only mothers manage. Serena was 37 with a kind of composed beauty that I'd never quite gotten comfortable around. She was always put together, always appropriate, always said the right thing at the right moment, in a tone that was warm enough to pass for genuine. She worked in marketing, or had before she'd stepped back to focus on family, as she put it. I'd never found a reason to distrust her exactly. I just never found a reason to fully relax around her either. Dinner was the usual arrangement: food on the table, polite exchanges across it, long stretches where the only sound was silverware against ceramic. Brandon asked how I was sleeping. I said fine. Serena mentioned something about the roads being icy on Route 11. I nodded. We cleaned up without incident. After dinner, Serena set my evening medication on the counter, the small lineup of pills that had become a nightly ritual since the summer. Carol Deming, the home health aide Brandon had arranged for me back in September, had organized everything into a weekly pill organizer. Very efficient, very thorough. I appreciated the system even when I didn't particularly appreciate needing it. I swallowed the pills without looking at them closely. I hadn't looked closely in a long time. Later, when Brandon and Serena had retreated to the guest room and the house had settled back into its particular brand of silence, I wandered into the living room. I don't know what drew me there exactly. Habit, maybe. Or the kind of restlessness that comes when your body is tired, but your mind refuses to follow. I stood by the window for a while, watching the first few flakes of what the forecast was calling a significant lake effect event start to drift down under the streetlight. Then, for some reason, I couldn't immediately explain, my eyes traveled up to the far corner of the room, the junction where the wall met the ceiling, half hidden behind the edge of a bookshelf. The camera was still there. I'd mounted it in 2015 after our neighbors down the road had a break-in. One of those small, unobtrusive units barely bigger than a deck of cards. I'd set it up, tested it, and then somewhere in the chaos of the following years, simply forgotten about it. I'd never gone back to check if it was still recording. Never thought about it at all, really. It had just become part of the wall, invisible the way familiar things become invisible when you stop seeing them. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate, and I turned. Brandon was standing at the bottom of the staircase watching me. Dad. His voice was even, carefully, even in a way I'd grown used to without ever examining why. You look exhausted. You should really get some rest. I looked at my son, his dark eyes steady, unreadable, holding mine for just a beat longer than necessary. You're right, I said. I'll head up. I went upstairs. I lay down in the dark. I listened to the wind push itself against the house. I did not sleep. The snow had been falling for over an hour by the time I gave up on sleep entirely. I'd made my way back downstairs without turning on any lights out of habit, or maybe just because the dark felt more honest than whatever the fluorescence would have shown me. I stood at the kitchen window with a glass of water I wasn't drinking, watching the way the storm moved under the back porch light. Lake effect snow doesn't fall the way regular snow does. It doesn't drift or float. It comes sideways in dense curtains, like the lake itself is trying to push inland and claim the town. Watertown people know this snow. We've spent our whole lives learning its moods. Maggie used to love it. She'd stand in this exact spot sometimes, both palms wrapped around a mug of chamomile, just watching the yard disappear under white. She never needed to say anything on those nights. That was one of her gifts, the ability to be completely present without filling the air with words. She'd reach over sometimes and set her hand on my shoulder. Not a pat, not a squeeze, just her hand resting there, warm and steady and entirely sure of itself. I hadn't realized until she was gone that I'd been measuring my own calm against that hand for 40 years. Now the window just showed me my own reflection, an old man in a flannel shirt, hollow-eyed, holding a glass of water like he'd forgotten what it was for. The strange thing about the past 6 months was how ordinary it had all looked from the outside. August had been the first time something felt off. I'd started waking up with a heaviness behind my eyes that no amount of sleep seemed to fix. My hands trembled occasionally in the mornings, not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. I'd gone to see Dr. Paul Greer, my family physician, over on Arsenal Street, a steady and careful man I'd trusted for 15 years. He'd run some tests, reviewed my chart, and told me in his measured way that grief did unusual things to the body. Stress, too. He'd adjusted one of my prescriptions and told me to come back in 6 weeks. I'd gone back. He'd said I seemed to be stabilizing. I'd believed him. September had brought a different kind of weight. Brandon had come down one Sunday with a folder of documents, financial power of attorney. He explained something to have in place given my health concerns, just a precaution, completely standard for someone my age and my situation. He'd walked me through it, the way you'd walk someone through a menu at a restaurant, pointing at things, explaining in general terms, moving along before I had time to read the fine print. I'd signed. I'm not proud of that. A man who spent 4 decades in accounting, who could spot an error in a balance sheet from across a desk. I'd signed a legal document without reading it properly, because my son had sat across from me with Maggie's eyes and told me it was just a precaution. Because I'd been tired. Because it had only been 3 months since we'd buried her, and I hadn't had the energy to be suspicious of my own child. That was September. October had been the stairs. I still wasn't sure what to make of it. I'd been coming down to the kitchen in the morning, same as always, and somewhere between the 4th and 5th step, my foot had gone wrong, a slip, a lurch, that stomach-dropping instant of pure freefall. Brandon had been right there just behind me, and to my left, his hand shooting out to catch my shoulder. He'd steadied me. Of course he had. I hadn't fallen, but I'd replayed that moment more times than I could count since then, and I couldn't say with certainty whether the pressure of his hand had been pulling me back or for just a fraction of a second before it caught something else. It was probably nothing, the kind of dark thought that grief plants in you when you're not watching. Still, I'd started holding the railing every time after that. I was still standing at the window, still not drinking my water, when my eyes dropped to the floor near the base of the refrigerator. The bowl was still there. White porcelain chipped along one edge with a faded blue ring painted around the rim. Maggie had used it for the dog we'd had years ago, a shepherd mix named Rusty, who'd passed when Brandon was still in high school. After Rusty was gone, she'd kept the bowl. Couldn't bring herself to throw it out. Said it still had some use left in it. Brandon had tried to get rid of it twice this fall. Both times I'd said no without fully understanding why. Maybe because it was one more thing that had been hers. Maybe because some part of me knew that when the last objects disappeared, something else would disappear with them. I left it where it was. The knock came at 9:32 by the microwave clock, 3 sharp raps that cut straight through the sound of the wind. Not a timid knock. Not the uncertain tapping of someone hoping you might answer. 3 solid, intentional strikes, the kind made by a person who needed to be heard. I set down my glass and went to the front door. The man standing on my porch was somewhere in his mid-60s, lean and weathered in the way that comes from years of working outdoors. His jacket a dark canvas thing that had probably been waterproof once and wasn't anymore. His name I'd learn in the next few minutes was Eugene Marsh, and he was the kind of man you recognized, even if you'd never met him, the sort of person who'd been knocked around by life plenty and had come through it not bitter but careful. He held his hands slightly out from his sides, the universal gesture of, I mean no harm, even as the snow drove sideways against his back. Beside him sat a dog, a golden retriever, large, broad-chested, with the patient, settled posture of an animal that had learned long ago how to wait. His coat was thick with melting snow, and he was watching me with the kind of steady attention that most people never quite manage. His name, Eugene would tell me, was Cody. "Sir," Eugene said, and his voice was rough from the cold. "I'm real sorry to bother you. My truck went into a ditch about a quarter mile back. I just need to wait out the worst of it." He paused. Just Cody doesn't do well left in the cold. I hadn't even gotten a word out before Brandon appeared at my shoulder. Dad. His voice carried that particular brand of calm that I'd learned meant the opposite. We don't take in strangers. Not people, not animals. A brief pause. Either of them. I looked at Eugene. His jaw was tight, not from offense, but from cold. His teeth were working to keep from chattering. I looked at Cody, who hadn't moved, who was simply watching me with those quiet, amber eyes, as if he was waiting to see what kind of man I turned out to be. I pulled the door open wider. "Come in," I said. "Both of you." Eugene let out a breath and nodded once deeply, the way men do when they're too proud to say thank you outright, but mean it completely. I stepped back to let them through, and as Cody crossed the threshold, I noticed Brandon. He wasn't watching Eugene. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the dog, steady, unblinking, with an expression I hadn't seen on my son's face in a long time. Not suspicion, not annoyance, something quieter than that. Something that looked almost like recognition, like a man who had just seen something walk through his door that he'd been hoping would never show up. By 10 o'clock, the storm had settled into something steady and serious. I could hear it working against the eaves, that low, persistent pressure of wind, finding every gap it could. But inside the kitchen, the old gas range was throwing heat the way it always had, and the room had taken on that particular kind of warmth that only exists when the weather outside is genuinely trying to get at you. The contrast made the air feel thicker somehow, more deliberate. Eugene Marsh sat across from me at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee he'd declined. The tea said he hadn't developed a taste for it, said it with the easy self-awareness of a man who knew exactly who he was and had stopped apologizing for it. He'd shed his wet jacket and hung it on the back of the chair without being asked, the way a person does when they've been guests in enough homes to know the protocol without needing to be told. Cody had settled near the back door on the braided rug that Maggie had picked out at a craft fair years ago. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't exploring. He simply lay with his broad chin resting on his front paws, amber eyes half open, as calm and unhurried as if he'd been sleeping in this kitchen his whole life. Watching him, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while. Company. The uncomplicated kind. "Retired 4 years ago," Eugene said when I asked. "Spent most of my working life with Jefferson County Engineering Department roads and infrastructure mostly. Lot of time out on the county routes, lot of winters just like this one." He said it without nostalgia or complaint, just the plain recitation of a life that had been what it had been. He was 64. I guess the kind of 64 that comes from decades of outdoor work, all lean and angular, with the sort of stillness in his hands that you see in people who've learned to conserve movement. "After I retired," he went on, "I found I needed something to do with the time. Started checking in on folks, older neighbors, people living alone out on the county roads. Nothing official, just something to do." He glanced down at his coffee. "Keeps the days from getting too long." I understood that better than I wanted to admit. "You live out this way?" I asked. "About 2 miles east. Old place off Route 12. Nothing fancy." He smiled slightly. "Suits me fine." I refilled his coffee without asking. He let me, which told me he was comfortable. We sat with the sound of the storm for a moment, and it wasn't uncomfortable, which told me something about him. "What about Cody?" I asked after a while. Eugene glanced at the dog. Cody's ear twitched, but he didn't lift his head. "Found him on County Route 12, Eugene said. 3 winters back, maybe 3.5. There'd been a research facility operating out past the county line. I won't pretend I knew exactly what they were doing out there, some kind of contract work. They shut down, pulled out fast, the way those operations sometimes do, and Cody was just there." standing on the shoulder of the road like he was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. He paused. He was in good shape. Well-fed, healthy, calm. Clearly trained for something. I put out inquiries, checked around, never did find out who he belonged to or what he'd been trained to do. He shook his head slowly. After a while, I stopped trying to figure it out and started just watching what he paid attention to. Turned out that was more useful anyway. He said it simply without drama, the way you'd describe any practical adjustment you'd made in life. I looked at Cody. The dog looked back at me with those unhurried eyes. "He's not a regular dog," I said. Eugene almost smiled. "No, he is not." The conversation moved in the way that late-night conversations do when two people have nothing to prove to each other, slowly, without agenda, following the shape of whatever came up. At one point, Eugene mentioned his son. Briefly, the way you mention something when you've made a kind of peace with it, but haven't forgotten its weight. "He's out in Phoenix now," he said. "We don't talk much." A pause. These things happen between fathers and sons sometimes. It's no one's fault, really. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. The tone he used wasn't self-pity, it was something quieter than that. The voice of a man who had sat with a hard thing long enough to stop fighting it. I thought about Brandon upstairs, about the signed document in a drawer somewhere, about a hand on my shoulder on a staircase. I didn't say any of that. "Did your wife have a long illness?" Eugene asked after a stretch of quiet. The question wasn't intrusive. He'd asked it the way he seemed to do most things, carefully, with full awareness that he was asking. "No," I said. "She wasn't sick. It was sudden. One day she was here, and then she wasn't." Something shifted in Eugene's expression. Not pity. More like the careful attention of someone filing away information they consider significant. His eyes steadied on me for just a moment, before he looked back down at his mug. "I see," he said quietly. 2 words, completely ordinary. But something in the way he said them made me want to ask what exactly he saw, and I couldn't explain why. It was Cody who interrupted the silence that followed. I'd been watching the steam rise off my tea when I noticed his head come up. Not the lazy lift of an animal reacting to a sound, something more deliberate than that. His nose tilted slightly upward, working in that focused, methodical way that meant he was reading something in the air I couldn't detect. His ears moved forward, independent and precise, like 2 small instruments orienting toward a signal. He was facing the hallway that led to the back of the house toward the room Brandon used as a home office whenever he stayed over. The door was closed. As far as I knew, it had been closed since before dinner. Cody's tail was still, not the stillness of a relaxed animal. The stillness of one that had found exactly what it was looking for and was deciding what to do about it. Before that, though, earlier in the evening while we'd been talking, I'd caught him doing something else. He'd been lying exactly as he was now, quiet and unobtrusive, when his gaze had drifted to the far corner of the living room, just visible through the doorway, the upper corner where the wall met the ceiling. He'd stared at that particular spot, with the same unblinking steadiness he was showing now. I'd filed it away without knowing what to do with it. Eugene, who had apparently noticed me noticing, had set down his mug and said without any particular inflection, "With Cody, I've learned not to ask questions. Just remember where he looks." Now, sitting in the kitchen, with the storm pressing at the windows, and my son's office door closed at the end of the dark hallway, I was finding that advice a great deal harder to set aside than I would have liked. Cody didn't move. He simply watched the hallway with that total, absolute focus, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it already knows exactly what it has found. There's a difference between a dog exploring an unfamiliar place and a dog searching for something specific. I'd owned dogs before Rusty, and before him a beagle mix named Fletcher that we'd had when Brandon was small. I knew the loose, curious energy of an animal taking in new smells, new textures mapping a space for the first time. Head-low nose working in broad sweeps, tail moving with that easy, unfocused interest. Cody wasn't doing any of that. He moved through the living room, the way a person moves through a place they once knew well and are now returning to after a long absence, deliberate, unhurried, with the particular attentiveness of someone checking whether things are still where they left them. He wasn't exploring. He was looking. I followed at a distance, not wanting to interrupt whatever he was doing. Eugene had stood up from the kitchen table without a word and come to stand in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, watching. Brandon was already there. He'd come downstairs at some point without my hearing him. I noticed him now settled into the armchair near the far wall, the television remote in his hand, the screen dark. He wasn't watching Cody with the open, slightly bemused interest most people show around an unfamiliar dog. His eyes tracked the animal with a careful, contained attention. His right hand, I noticed, had tightened around the remote, not gripping it exactly, just holding it differently than a moment before. Cody passed within a few feet of him without acknowledging him. Brandon watched him go. The dog made his way back toward the kitchen with that same unhurried purpose, and that's when he stopped. The white porcelain bowl was still where I'd left it, tucked into the corner beside the base of the refrigerator, out of the way, easy to overlook. Cody approached it slowly the last few steps. Almost careful, the way you approach something you recognize but want to confirm before committing to the recognition. He lowered his nose to the bowl and held it there. Not a quick sniff. A long, still, concentrated investigation, the kind that isn't about curiosity, but about certainty. His whole body quieted in a way I hadn't seen since he'd come through the front door. Even his breathing seemed to change. Then, with a slowness that felt almost intentional, he folded himself down onto the floor beside the bowl. His broad chin came to rest on the tiles, his muzzle inches from the porcelain rim. He didn't close his eyes. He just lay there alongside it in the manner of an animal observing a period of stillness that meant something I didn't have the language for. Eugene had come fully into the kitchen doorway. When I looked at him, his expression was one I hadn't seen on him yet, not quite sad, but weighted. Careful in a different way than usual. "That bowl," he said quietly enough that it didn't carry past the two of us. It meant something to someone he knew. I looked at the bowl-chipped rim, faded blue ring sitting in the same corner where Maggie had always kept it. I didn't ask him to explain further. I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the explanation. Cody rose. No particular signal that I could identify. He simply stood smoothly and without hurry and turned toward the hallway that ran along the back of the house. Past the laundry room, past the coat closet ending at the door of the room Brandon used as a home office. A room that had been closed since before dinner. A room I had not been inside since sometime in October, when I'd gone in to look for a stapler, and Brandon had appeared in the doorway almost immediately asking if I needed help finding something. Cody walked to that door without stopping, without hesitating. Without any of the tentative investigation he might have given another closed room in a strange house. He stopped 6 inches from the door. The sound he made was not the frantic, high-pitched barking of an anxious animal. It was short, even deliberate 3 measured alerts, each one identical, each one landing in the quiet hallway like a statement rather than a reaction. Then he raised one paw and dragged it down the wood. Once, twice, 3 times. Precise and unhurried. The silence afterward felt louder than the barking had. Eugene crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and crouched beside Cody, one hand resting on the dog's back. He looked up at me from that position, and his voice was very steady. "I should have told you this earlier," he said. "The facility where I found him, they were doing detection work. Chemical compounds. Substances that don't belong in a home environment." He kept his eyes on mine. "Cody's been trained to identify those compounds, harmful ones, the kind that accumulate slowly." A pause. "In 3 years, he has never reacted like this without a reason." I stood in the hallway, and looked at the closed door. And in the space between one breath and the next, my mind did something it had been carefully avoiding for months. It connected things: the heaviness behind my eyes since August, the trembling in my hands that Dr. Greer had attributed to grief and stress, the pills in the weekly organizer that Carol arranged with such meticulous care, the way the capsules had looked different slightly, just slightly from the ones I'd been taking the year before, and how I'd told myself I was imagining it. And Maggie, who had not been sick, who had been here one morning, and then by degrees, and then all at once, she hadn't been, who had tried to say something to me from her bed with a grip I still felt in my hand on quiet nights, who had looked at me with eyes that I'd told myself were confused by medication. What if they hadn't been confused at all? What if she'd been trying to warn me? I was still standing there, not moving, when the light at the far end of the hallway came on. Brandon stood at the top of the basement stairs. He must have come up through the back, framed in the doorway in a t-shirt and sweatpants, hair undisturbed, eyes fully alert, in the way that has nothing to do with having just woken up. His voice, when it came, was measured and flat in equal parts. Dad. His gaze moved from me to Cody and back again. Get that animal away from my office door. Right now. Not please. Not what's going on. Not even the performative concern he usually managed for these moments. Just the instruction, delivered like a man who was not accustomed to having to repeat himself. I looked at my son standing in the hallway of the house I'd built, the house where his mother had cooked Sunday dinners and recovered chair cushions, and tried at the end to tell me something I hadn't leaned close enough to hear. Cody stood at the door, still, tail straight, eyes unwavering. 38 years I had known this person. 38 years of birthdays and little league games and arguments over curfews and phone calls from college, and the particular pride of watching a child become a man. For the first time in all of those years, standing in my own hallway at nearly midnight, with the storm still working at the windows and a trained animal pressing its nose against my son's locked office door, I was not sure I knew him at all. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table since 4 a.m. Not by choice, exactly the kind of sitting that happens when you lie in the dark long enough, and your body finally admits what your mind already knew: sleep isn't coming, and pretending otherwise is just wasted time. So I'd gotten up, made a pot of coffee I didn't particularly want, and settled into the chair that faced the back window. The storm had passed some time before dawn. Outside the yard was a study in stillness. Every surface buried under 8, maybe 10 inches of new snow. The fence posts wearing their white caps. The bare oak at the property line holding its branches out like it was asking a question. The kind of morning that would have made Maggie reach for her camera. She'd have been up before me already in her coat on the back steps, trying to catch the light before it changed. I drank my cold coffee and watched the light change alone. Eugene came downstairs just after 6, with Cody at his heels, both of them moving with the quiet consideration of guests who know the house is still mostly asleep. Roads should be passable by 7:30, Eugene said, checking the window over the sink. He said it neutrally without the implication of a question, but I heard one anyway. Stay for breakfast, I said. Both of you. He didn't argue. That was one of the things I was already coming to appreciate about Eugene Marsh. He didn't perform reluctance when he didn't feel it. He just pulled out a chair and sat down, and Cody settled under the table with his chin on his paws, and for 40 minutes, the kitchen felt like a place where something normal was happening. I made eggs. Eugene ate without complaint. Cody accepted a piece of toast with the grave dignity of an animal doing you a small favor. When they finally stood to leave, Eugene zipped his jacket and picked up the scrap of paper he'd written on while I was at the stove. My number, he said, setting it on the counter beside the coffee maker. He looked at me directly. If you need anything, Mr. Keene, anything at all. The way he said it, the slight pause before repeating himself, the steadiness in his eyes made it clear he wasn't talking about jumper cables or a cup of borrowed sugar. He meant something more open-ended than that. Something that covered a wider range of circumstances. I folded the paper and put it in my shirt pocket without explanation. He nodded once. I watched from the front window as his truck, back on all four wheels, now pulled free sometime during the night, made its way down County Route 202 and disappeared around the curve. Cody was a golden shape in the passenger seat watching the road ahead. The house felt quieter after they left. A different kind of quiet than the usual kind. Carol Deming arrived at exactly 8 o'clock. She was 49, trim and composed, with dark hair cut practically short, and the kind of efficient, unhurried movements that suggested a person who had arranged their life to eliminate unnecessary steps. She'd been coming to the house 5 days a week since September, when Brandon had explained that given my health concerns, having some additional support around the house would be sensible. Carol managed my medications, kept track of my appointments with Dr. Greer, handled the grocery coordination, and generally ensured that the household ran with a smoothness it hadn't possessed since Maggie was alive. She was good at her job. Exceptionally good in ways that I'd accepted as professionalism and hadn't examined further. "Morning, Mr. Keene." Her smile was already in place when she came through the door, not the forced brightness of someone performing cheerfulness, but something more precise than that, a smile that arrived at exactly the right moment, calibrated to exactly the right degree. "Roads were something this morning. How are you feeling?" "Fine," I said, the way I always said fine. She already had her coat hung up and was moving toward the kitchen, where she began organizing the counter with practiced efficiency. She knew without asking that I preferred my morning coffee weak and my afternoon coffee strong. She knew which cabinet held the measuring cups and which drawer stuck unless you lifted the handle slightly before pulling. She knew the house in the way that comes from paying close attention to it, which I'd always taken as thoroughness, and which this morning I found myself thinking about differently. Brandon came downstairs around 8:30, dressed and put together in the way he always managed, even at that hour. He poured himself coffee, exchanged a few words with Carol about the weekend roads. At one point, she said something low that I didn't catch from my position at the table, and Brandon's eyes moved briefly to me, then back to her, and he gave a small nod. Not an unusual nod. The kind two people give each other when they share an understanding. I looked down at my newspaper. I didn't read a word of it. Carol stepped out of the kitchen to make a call around 9, and while she was in the hallway, I did something I hadn't done in months. I looked at my pills. Not the casual glance of a man confirming he'd taken the right number, a real look. The weekly organizer sat on the counter where it always sat, today's compartment already open. I picked up the 2 capsules designated for morning and held them in my palm under the kitchen light. The blood pressure medication, I'd been taking it for 6 years. I knew what it looked like. White, round, about the size of an aspirin. The capsule in my hand was off-white, slightly yellowish in the way of something that had been substituted rather than aged. And the shape was wrong, not round, but gently oval, the kind of difference that's easy to miss when you're not looking and impossible to unsee once you are. I set them back in the organizer. I didn't know what to do with that observation yet, so I filed it away in the same place I'd been filing things for months, that quiet ledger at the back of my mind, where I kept the items I wasn't ready to act on, and I went to refill my coffee. It was on my way back from the laundry room, where I'd gone to swap out a load, that I saw her. The door to the hallway bathroom, the one with the built-in medicine cabinet, was open. Carol stood in front of it, facing the shelves. She wasn't taking anything out. She wasn't putting anything back. She was running her fingers lightly along the tops of the prescription bottles, one after another, in the methodical way of someone counting inventory they've memorized and are verifying. I stopped in the doorway. She turned, not startled, not flustered, with the same even composure that seemed to operate independently of circumstances, just making sure everything's accounted for, Mr. Keene. Her smile arrived on schedule. I like to stay on top of these things. Of course, I said. I went back to the kitchen. Behind me, I heard the soft click of the cabinet closing. Then a few seconds later, the faint, deliberate sound of fingers moving across a phone screen. I stood at the kitchen counter with my coffee and listened to it, and thought about a woman who knew exactly where everything in this house was kept, who smiled at precisely the right moments, who had been arranged into my life by my son, and who apparently had somewhere to be with the information she was gathering. I thought about all of that. I didn't say a word. Brandon and Serena left around 2 in the afternoon. I heard them before I saw them. The particular sounds of people preparing to go somewhere, the zipper of a coat keys lifted from the hook by the front door, a brief exchange in the hallway that stopped when they reached the living room where I was sitting. Brandon said they were going into town, picking up a few things, would be back before dinner. Serena smiled and said she'd bring home something from the Italian place on Arsenal Street if I was interested. I said that sounded fine. The front door closed. The sound of Brandon's car receded down the driveway. Somewhere above me, I could hear Carol moving through the upstairs rooms, with the steady, methodical efficiency she brought to everything, the soft drag of a vacuum, a cabinet opening and closing, her footsteps crossing the hallway overhead. I sat in the living room and looked at the wall. We'd started putting photographs up sometime in the late 80s, Maggie and I back when Brandon was small enough that a good weekend still meant a trip to Black Lake and a cooler packed with sandwiches. The wall had accumulated over the decades the way walls do in houses where people actually live, school pictures and holiday snapshots and the occasional framed print Maggie had picked up somewhere, layered over years until the arrangement stopped being curated and became simply the record of a life. I hadn't really looked at it in months, not since the summer. My eyes found the photograph they always found eventually. Brandon at 7 years old, standing at the edge of the lake on a July morning, holding up a largemouth bass with both hands and grinning the grin of a child who has just accomplished something enormous. 2 front teeth missing. Hair still wet from when he'd slipped off the dock 20 minutes earlier, wearing the orange life jacket he'd fought me on every single morning of that trip, and had secretly been grateful for, I suspected, ever since the slipping incident. I remembered taking that picture. I remembered the weight of the camera, and the light on the water, and the particular pride of watching a 7-year-old discover that patience and persistence actually worked. I used to walk past that photo every day without stopping. Lately, I'd been walking past it without looking. There had been a time when Brandon was the kind of child other parents mentioned approvingly. Responsible, they said. Thoughtful, a boy who remembered to say thank you, and held doors open, and sat through his grandfather's long stories without fidgeting. The teenage years had brought the usual distance, the closed bedroom door, the monosyllabic answers at dinner, the sense that he was conducting an entire interior life that had nothing to do with us. Maggie had handled that phase better than I had. She'd given him room to be difficult, without taking it personally, and somewhere around 19 or 20 he'd come back to us in the way that children sometimes do, a little humbled by the world and more willing to be known. That version of Brandon had lasted a long time. Long enough that I'd stopped thinking of the teenage distance as anything but a phase. Then about 5 years ago, Serena had come into his life. I want to be precise about this because I've spent a lot of time examining the sequence. I'm not saying she changed him overnight. I'm saying that after she arrived, the changes in Brandon accumulated in a direction I noticed, but couldn't name at the time. The phone calls grew shorter. Not absent, he still called. Still came for holidays, but shorter and somehow more managed. Like conversations that had been reviewed before they happened. The visits home got briefer. He was always busy, always in the middle of something, always on his way somewhere. Maggie noticed it before I did, which didn't surprise me. She noticed most things before I did. She hadn't disliked Serena openly. That wasn't her way. But she'd said to me once very quietly in the kitchen after a holiday visit, "There's something about that girl, Walter. She listens too carefully." I'd told her she was being unfair. I thought about that now, sitting in the living room, with the photographs on the wall and the sound of Carol's footsteps overhead. Then, after Maggie passed, Brandon had suggested moving back in. Just temporarily, he'd said, just to make sure I was managing just until things stabilized. It had seemed like kindness. It had seemed like exactly the kind of thing a devoted son would do. The timing in retrospect was very precise. I'm not sure what made me go upstairs, not to the guest room. To our bedroom, Maggie's and mine, the one at the end of the hall that I still thought of as ours, even though it had been just mine since June. I moved quietly out of long habit, rather than any conscious decision, and I sat down at the small writing desk in the corner that had been Maggie's domain for 30 years. The desk was mostly as she'd left it. I'd cleared a few things after she passed her reading glasses, a library book she'd never finished, but the drawers I'd left alone. I opened the middle one now and looked at the accumulated contents. Old receipts, a birthday card I'd given her sometime in the 90s, a small leather address book she'd stopped using when everyone migrated to phones, a handful of photographs that hadn't made it to the wall. I was turning a photograph over in my hands, Brandon and Maggie at his college graduation, both of them squinting into the sun, when I saw the corner of a folded piece of paper wedged against the back panel of the drawer. Small, folded twice. The paper had the slightly soft texture of something that had been handled often. I unfolded it. Maggie's handwriting. I would know it anywhere, the particular slant of her letters, the way she formed her capital W's. But the hand that had written this had been unsteady. The letters were larger than usual, pressed harder into the paper, the way someone writes when they're concentrating hard on the physical act of forming words. I read what was legible. Walter, don't believe what Brandon tells you about my medication. The sentence ended there, not at a period, but at a smear, a long diagonal blur, where water or something like it had crossed the page and taken the rest of the words with it. Whatever she'd written after that was gone. 2 or 3 lines at least reduced to nothing. I sat on the edge of the bed and held the paper in both hands and read those 15 words again and again. The room was very quiet. Through the window, the late afternoon light was going gray and flat, the way December light does when the clouds come back in. I could still hear Carol somewhere overhead, moving with that steady professional efficiency through a house she knew better than she should have. I folded the paper carefully and put it in the pocket of my flannel shirt, close against my chest. I was still sitting on the edge of the bed, my hands in my lap, when I heard it. Footsteps. Just outside the bedroom door, soft and unhurried, the kind that belonged to someone moving through a familiar space without thinking about the noise they're making. They stopped. Directly outside the door, I heard nothing for a span of several seconds. No knock, no voice, just the particular quality of silence that exists when someone on the other side of a door is standing still. Then they moved away. Quickly. Down the hallway and back toward the stairs with the light, rapid efficiency of a person who had remembered suddenly that they had somewhere else to be. I looked at the closed door and did not move. In my shirt pocket, the folded paper pressed against my ribs like something with a pulse. If you're still here, comment "I'm here," so I know you're still with me. And tell me this. If you were in my place, would you stay quiet and wait for more proof? Or confront the truth right now, even if it meant risking everything you believed in? And just a quick note. The next part includes some added fictional elements for storytelling purposes. It may not fully reflect reality, but the message behind it is still worth thinking about. Brandon's car was gone before 7. I heard it from the bedroom, the engine turning over in the cold, the slow crunch of tires on packed snow, and then nothing. By the time I came downstairs, the house had already settled back into its familiar quiet. Carol wasn't due until 8. The kitchen was mine for a while. I was on my second cup of coffee when the knock came. 3 measured raps, not urgent but deliberate. The kind of knock that belongs to someone who has rehearsed it. Bill Cantwell was standing on the front porch with his wool cap held in both hands, turning it slowly by the brim, the way men do when they've come to say something difficult and haven't quite figured out how to begin. He was 73, broad through the shoulders, even now, with a face that had always reminded me of weathered fence posts, solid, reliable, shaped by decades of exposure to things that didn't particularly care how hard they hit you. He and I had been neighbors since the mid-90s. We'd shared a property line, and the occasional bottle of something decent, and the unspoken understanding that good neighbors mostly leave each other alone. He looked standing there in the cold morning, like a man who hadn't slept properly in a long time. "Walter," he said, "you got a few minutes? I made a fresh pot." We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and for a while neither of us said anything. That was all right. We were old enough to know that some conversations need a moment to find their footing. Bill wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the table surface. The kitchen clock marked the seconds. Outside, a crow landed on the back fence, looked around with that sharp avian authority, and left. "I've been trying to come over here since July," Bill said finally. "Every week I'd tell myself today was the day, and then I'd—" He stopped, set down his mug. I kept thinking maybe I was wrong about what I saw, that it was dark and I was tired, and old men's eyes play tricks. He looked up at me. "But I wasn't wrong, Walter. I've known that the whole time." I waited. He'd had back trouble for years, an old injury that flared in cold weather and made sleeping difficult on bad nights. The night Maggie passed in the middle of June, he'd been up since 1 in the morning, moving from the bed to the chair to the window, the way you do when discomfort won't let you settle. His bedroom window faced the side of our house. He'd stood there in the dark, not really looking at anything, just existing in the uncomfortable way of someone waiting for a bad hour to pass. At some point close to 2 in the morning, the light in our upstairs bedroom came on. Not our room. Maggie and I had been sleeping in separate rooms that month, her in the main bedroom because of her restless nights, and me down the hall. Something we'd arranged as a practical matter without reading anything into it. The light Bill saw was from the main bedroom, our bedroom, where Maggie slept alone. The curtains were thin," Bill said. "The light came right through them, and I could see—" He paused, and something crossed his face that I recognized as the particular expression of a person who has replayed an image so many times it has worn grooves in them. There were 2 shapes, one in the bed, one standing beside it. He set his hands flat on the table. The one standing it wasn't moving around. It wasn't doing anything helpful. It was just there, still, watching. His voice had dropped to something barely above the kitchen's ambient sounds. "I saw her check her watch, twice. The second time she looked toward the window." He meant Serena. I knew it before he said it. Some part of me had already assembled the shape of what was coming from the moment he'd appeared on my porch, with his hat in his hands. I sat with my coffee and let him finish. A few minutes later she walked out. Normal pace. Lights stayed on. He exhaled slowly. It wasn't long after that, maybe 10-15 minutes, that I heard the ambulance. The kitchen was very quiet. "I should have called someone," Bill said. "That night, or the next day, or the day after that." His jaw worked. I told myself I didn't know what I was looking at. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself a lot of things that I'm not proud of, Walter. His eyes were wet. The kind of wet that belongs to a man who doesn't let himself cry easily and is losing that particular fight right now. "She looked toward the window," he said. "Right near the end. She was looking out and I was standing there, and we saw each other, just for a second through the dark." His voice broke at the edge of the last word. "She looked right at me, Walter. And I just stood there. I didn't speak. I placed both hands flat on the table palms down the way I used to do at my desk when numbers weren't adding up, and I needed to keep myself from reacting before I understood the full picture. The surface was cold under my hands. I focused on that. The specific physical fact of cold wood under my palms while everything else tried to rise. I breathed. I did not trust myself to say a single word. I walked Bill to the door when he stood to leave. We didn't shake hands. He put his wool cap back on with the careful movements of a man who had put down something heavy and wasn't sure yet whether he felt better or worse for it. He went down the front steps and across the yard, leaving dark impressions in the snow, and I stood in the open doorway and watched him go until he'd passed through the gate and disappeared up the road. I turned back into the house. Carol was standing at the top of the staircase. She had one hand resting on the banister. Her body angled slightly toward the lower landing, and she was looking down at me with that composed, calibrated expression that never quite shifted into anything you could name. She'd arrived at some point while Bill and I were talking. I hadn't heard the door, which meant she'd come in quietly, or had been here longer than I realized. Mr. Keene." Her voice was its usual even temperature. "Is everything all right?" I heard voices. I looked up at her, considered the angle of where she was standing, considered how much of the kitchen conversation would carry up an open staircase in a house this quiet, considered the phone she was never without. "Everything's fine," I said. "Thank you, Carol." She nodded and moved back down the hallway with her customary efficiency. I stayed at the bottom of the stairs a moment longer, looking up at the empty landing. I thought about how long she'd been standing there before she'd decided to let me know she was there at all. I spent the rest of that day doing something I hadn't done since my accounting years. I watched, without letting on that I was watching. Bill's words had settled into me the way cold does when you've been outside too long, gradually, completely, until you stop noticing the sensation and start noticing only what it's changed. I wasn't ready to confront anyone. I wasn't ready to do much of anything, except pay attention in a way I hadn't been paying attention before. Carol moved through the house with her usual seamless efficiency, and I moved through it with her, and neither of us gave any indication that the morning had been anything other than ordinary. But I watched. I watched her glance at her phone when she thought I was focused on my book, the quick, practiced check of someone who is expecting updates. I watched her position herself near the doorway of whichever room I was making calls from her movements, always having some plausible domestic explanation, straightening a shelf, adjusting a lamp that put her within reasonable earshot. I watched the way she asked, twice in one afternoon, whether I was planning to go out, the question phrased as consideration landing as something else. She was thorough. I'd give her that. And she'd been thorough, I now understood, for every one of the 3 months she'd been inside this house. Eugene came by on the evening of the 4th day, while the sun was still going down over the tree line, and the temperature had dropped back into the kind of cold that makes the snow squeak underfoot. He brought a container of chicken soup from a place on Outer Washington Street, a diner that had been operating since before either of us could remember, and set it on the counter without fanfare. The way a person delivers something useful without requiring gratitude for it. Cody came in behind him and made his way to the kitchen with the unhurried familiarity of an animal that had decided this particular house was worth revisiting. He went directly to the corner by the refrigerator and stood for a moment over the white porcelain bowl nose, working in that quiet, methodical way. Then he folded himself down beside it, chin on the tile exactly as he had before. Some things apparently required more than one visit to process. We ate at the kitchen table, Eugene and I, and talked about things that had nothing to do with what was actually on my mind. The road conditions, the county's salt budget, a hardware store on Arsenal Street that was rumored to be closing after 30 years. The ordinary conversation of 2 men sitting with something unspoken between them, giving it room. It was when we moved to the living room afterward that Cody did it again. He'd been lying near the doorway with the settled patience that seemed to be his default state, and then without any preceding agitation or obvious trigger, he raised his head and fixed his gaze on the upper corner of the far wall. The same corner. The 3rd time I'd watched him do exactly this. Eugene looked where the dog was looking. I looked too, and this time, instead of standing at a distance and filing it away, I pulled a chair over and stepped up onto it. The camera was smaller than I remembered. A compact unit maybe 4 inches across, matte black mounted flush against the wall, joined where it would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. A decade of undisturbed dust had turned it nearly the same color as the paint behind it. I ran my finger along the top edge and left a clean line in the gray. And Brandon told me he'd disconnected all the cameras. I said more to myself than to Eugene. When he moved back in, said he'd had someone come in and take care of it. I climbed down from the chair. Yeah, he didn't know about this one, I said. I ran this line myself back in 2015. It's on a separate circuit. Whoever he sent didn't have the full layout. Eugene looked at the camera, then at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I waited until well after midnight. Eugene had gone home around 9. The house had been quiet for 2 hours before I moved Brandon and Serena's light going dark. Then Carol's room on the far end of the hall settling into silence. I gave it another 40 minutes after that, lying on my back in the dark, watching the ceiling and listening to the house breathe. At just past 1 in the morning, I went downstairs in my socks and took the basement door slowly, the way you take a door when you've lived in a house long enough to know which hinge complains. The recording unit was where I'd left it in 2015, a gray metal box mounted to the wall beside the water heater behind a shelving unit of paint cans and old tools. The indicator light on the front panel was blue and steady, pulsing at the slow interval of a system running on low power but running. 10 years of compacted memory on a drive the size of a paperback. I found a USB drive in the drawer of the old workbench. I plugged it in and pulled the 3 most recent weeks of footage. I took it back upstairs to the small desk in my bedroom, and I opened the files. Most of it was nothing, empty rooms, the ordinary movements of a household, Carol crossing the living room, Brandon eating breakfast alone. I moved through it in fast increments, watching the timestamp climb. 18 days back I stopped, 2:47 in the morning. The living room lit only by the streetlight coming through the gap in the curtains. Brandon and Serena on the couch close together, speaking in the low register of people who believe they are alone. I turned up the volume on my laptop. Serena's voice was even and unhurried, the tone of someone discussing something practical. He's already having trouble keeping track of things, missing words, repeating himself. In 3 or 4 weeks, it won't matter what he says, no one will take it seriously. A brief pause. The paperwork is almost done. Frank just needs the last signature, and that'll be the end of it. Brandon said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly. Once, like a man confirming something he'd already decided not to argue with. I sat back from the screen. In my hand, the USB drive was warm from the laptop port. I closed my fingers around it. I was still sitting there not moving when I heard footsteps on the hardwood above me. Unhurried. Moving from the direction of the guest room toward the hallway. They reached the top of the basement stairs and stopped. The silence lasted long enough that I counted it. 4 seconds. 5. 6. Then they moved on back down the hall, and a door closed softly somewhere in the distance. I sat in the dark at the foot of the stairs and held the USB drive against my palm and did not breathe until the house had been quiet for a full minute. I spent all of the 5th day doing nothing. That's not entirely accurate. I moved through the house, I ate, I answered Carol's questions about whether I wanted chicken or soup for dinner with responses that must have sounded normal enough. But the USB drive sat in the inside pocket of my flannel shirt the entire day, and every time I was aware of its weight against my ribs, I found a reason to wait another hour before deciding what to do with it. Some things need a day to become real. What I'd heard on that footage was one of them. By the morning of the 6th day, I was done waiting. I called Frank Culver at 8 o'clock from the upstairs hallway with the bedroom door closed and the shower running in the bathroom across the hall as cover. Frank was my attorney, had been for 20 years a careful and methodical man who had drawn up our wills, handled a property dispute with a neighbor in 2011, and managed Maggie's estate paperwork after she passed. He was 58, trim and deliberate, with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who had spent decades being the person other people called when things went wrong. He picked up on the 2nd ring, not the 3rd, not after a pause or a shuffle of papers. The second ring in the flat tone of a man who has been expecting a specific call and has been unsure how long it would take to arrive. "Walter," he said. "I was wondering when you'd reach out." That alone told me something. His office was on Arsenal Street, on the second floor of a building that had housed one professional practice or another for as long as I could remember. The waiting room smelled of old paper and strong coffee, the specific combination that belongs to offices where serious work has been done for a long time. His assistant, a steady woman named Ruth, who had been with him for 15 years, showed me in without small talk. Frank was already standing when I entered, which he didn't usually do. We sat across from each other at his desk, and I set the USB drive between us without preamble. "There's footage on that," I said. 18 days back. Living room. You'll want to hear what's on it." He nodded, set it aside, and folded his hands on the desk. "I need to tell you something first," he said. He'd discovered the discrepancy in July, 5 weeks after Maggie passed. A routine review of the estate documents, the kind of procedural check he performed as a matter of practice, had surfaced an inconsistency in the signature on the primary will. He'd pulled the original from his own files, the document Maggie had signed in his presence 8 years ago, and compared it against the version Brandon had submitted for probate. The forgery was skilled. Whoever had done it understood the general character of Maggie's handwriting, the slight leftward lean, the way she connected certain letters. But Frank had watched Maggie sign her name across 20 years of documents. He knew the particular pressure she applied at the start of a capital M, the way her W's widened slightly at the base. The version in Brandon's submission didn't have those things. It had the impression of them without the substance. "I've been waiting," Frank said, "for you to come to me. I didn't want to approach you directly without more to go on. I needed to know you were in a position to act on it." I thought about the months I'd spent telling myself I was imagining things. The stairs in October, the pills, the symptoms that Dr. Greer had attributed to grief. "You should have called me," I said. "Yes," he said simply. "I should have." He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and produced a white envelope aged to the color of old ivory, sealed and unmarked, except for my name written in Maggie's hand across the front. I looked at it for a moment before I touched it. "She came to see me," Frank said. 3 days before she passed. She said she needed to update certain arrangements and that I should hold on to this." He paused. "She said to give it to you only if you were in danger." Her words exactly. I picked up the envelope. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a will, the real one. The one she'd prepared without Brandon's knowledge, leaving the entirety of her estate to the Jefferson County Community Foundation. Not to Brandon, not to me. To a charity she'd believed in quietly for years, the way Maggie believed in most things without announcement. The second was a letter folded twice my name on the outside, in the same unsteady hand as the scrap I'd found in the nightstand drawer. "Take that one home," Frank said quietly. "Read it when you're alone." I folded it back and placed it in the inside pocket of my jacket beside the place the USB drive had been all week. Then I took out the scrap from the nightstand and set it on the desk between us, the fragment with the smeared second half, the sentence that ended in a blur. Frank looked at it for a moment. "The word that's missing," I said. "After medication." "I know what it says," he told me. "She told me herself that day she came in." He met my eyes. She knew Walter. She'd figured it out about 2 weeks before the end. She was trying to document it. The office was very quiet. I was putting on my coat when he spoke again. "There's one more thing." He remained seated, hands still folded, watching me with the expression of a man delivering the last item on a difficult list. "Maggie's life insurance policy, $800,000. I waited. The original beneficiary was the Jefferson County Children's Foundation. It was changed 14 months ago, October of 2023. He paused. "Brandon is currently the sole beneficiary." The signature on the change of beneficiary form is Maggie's, or something intended to look like it. I had my hand on the back of the chair. I kept it there. She didn't sign that, I said. It wasn't a question. Frank shook his head once. I stood there with my hand on the chair and looked at the far wall of his office, a framed map of Jefferson County, the roads and boundaries and waterways of a place I'd lived my whole life. And I thought about a man I had raised from infancy who had looked at his mother's signature and practiced until he could replicate it well enough to redirect $800,000. I put on my coat. I walked out into the cold air of Arsenal Street and stood on the sidewalk for a moment before I could make myself move. I'd been awake since 4:30, not the restless circular wakefulness of the past several weeks, something more purposeful than that. I lay in the gray pre-dawn and went through what I had the footage on the USB drive now in Frank's keeping. The real will. The letter I still hadn't opened, sitting in my jacket pocket, like an unexploded thing I wasn't ready to handle. The forged insurance signature. The scrap of paper from Maggie's drawer, and the pills. The ones in the organizer that Carol arranged each week with such careful precision. By 6 o'clock, I had dressed and written a note saying I had a morning errand. I left before Carol arrived. Paul Greer's practice occupied the ground floor of a converted brick building on Outer Washington Street, the kind of neighborhood where a family doctor could still run an independent office without being absorbed by a hospital network, which was part of why I'd stayed with him for 15 years. He was 52, careful in the particular way of men who had learned caution through experience rather than temperament, and he had always struck me as genuinely interested in his patients, rather than merely responsible for them. I'd called ahead. He was waiting at the door when I arrived, which told me everything about the state of his conscience. He locked the door behind me and crossed to the window to draw the blinds, not quickly, deliberately, the way a person moves when they've decided to do something they've been avoiding and want to do it properly now that they've started. He didn't offer coffee. He sat down across from me and set a manila folder on the desk between us and put both hands flat on top of it. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "I've known that for a while." He'd flagged the anomaly in August, the first time my blood work had come back, with indicators that didn't align cleanly with grief and age-related stress, which had been his working explanation for my symptoms since the summer. A persistent suppression of cholinesterase enzyme activity showing up across 3 separate draws over 6 weeks. Low-level consistent. The kind of pattern that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but builds a picture over time for anyone paying attention. The picture it built was not a comfortable one. The dizziness, the fatigue that sleep didn't resolve, the occasional difficulty finding words mid-sentence which I'd been attributing to age and hadn't mentioned to anyone. All of it fit the profile of long-term low-dose exposure to a compound that interfered with the nervous system's basic chemistry. "I prepared a report," Greer said. "I was going to call you in, go over the results, recommend a specialist, and a formal investigation into the source." He stopped, looked at his hands. "That Brandon came to see me before I made that call." He described it the same way I imagined it had happened quietly without theater. Brandon hadn't threatened him overtly. He'd arrived at the office, waited until the last patient had gone, and sat down in the chair across from Greer's desk. He'd mentioned in the course of what he framed as a concerned son's inquiry about his father's health that he'd come across some information about a period several years back when Greer's prescription records had contained certain irregularities. Nothing that had been formally investigated, nothing that had gone anywhere, nothing that couldn't, if it surfaced now, cost a 52-year-old doctor everything he'd spent his career building. He didn't say, "Do this or don't do that," Greer said. He didn't have to. The message was clear enough. A pause. "I told myself you were stable, that the levels weren't acutely dangerous, that I'd act when there was a more obvious reason to act." He looked up. I kept waiting for that reason to arrive without requiring anything difficult from me. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the traffic on Washington Street through the closed blinds. It required something difficult from my wife instead, I said. Greer didn't answer that. He opened the folder and slid it across the desk. The records were thorough 6 months of blood work annotated in his careful hand, with the relevant values circled and compared against baseline. I looked through them without speaking, turning pages with the steady, deliberate attention I used to give financial documents that I needed to fully understand before I responded to them. Then I reached the last page. It was a separate report. A supplemental analysis dated 2 months after Maggie had passed, conducted on a preserved sample from the night she was admitted. I read the summary line twice. Arsenic. Elevated concentration. Consistent with extended exposure over a period of weeks. I ran it on my own, Greer said quietly. I didn't submit it anywhere. He stopped. Started again. I was afraid of what submitting it would set in motion. I set the page down. If she had come to me, Greer said, and his voice had changed, lost the careful, managed quality it had carried through the rest of the conversation. If she had come in even a week earlier, Walter, I would have seen it. I could have... Don't, I said, not harshly. I just didn't have room for his guilt on top of everything else I was carrying. I took the folder, thanked him, and stood up. The snow on Washington Street was light and purposeless, the kind that drifts down without accumulating just enough to settle on your shoulders and melt before you've walked a block. I stood outside Greer's building and let my eyes adjust to the flat winter light. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. The message was 7 words long. We know you've been talking to people, Walter. Come home and stop making this complicated. I read it once. Then again. They knew. Somehow through Carol, through someone watching, through whatever network of attention they'd built around me, they knew I'd been moving. And they were telling me they knew, which meant they'd decided that telling me was the better option over waiting, which meant they were accelerating. I put the phone in my coat pocket and stood on the sidewalk with the folder of medical records under my arm and the snow coming down on my shoulders, and I thought about a woman who had figured out what was happening to her, who had gone to her attorney and written a letter and hidden a note in a drawer, and who had not in the end had enough time. I was not going to make the same mistake. I started walking. I came home the evening of the 7th day and made dinner, and asked Carol about her weekend plans, and listened to her answer with every outward indication of a man whose most pressing concern was whether to defrost chicken or pork chops. It was the most exhausting performance of my life. The bedroom door was ajar when I came upstairs that night. I'd left it pulled shut. I always left it pulled shut, out of the particular habit of a man who'd shared a bedroom for 40 years and still observed the courtesies of it. The gap was small, easily explained as a draft a latch that hadn't caught a dozen ordinary things. The nightstand drawer was the confirmation. I'd kept the contents deliberately undisturbed since finding Maggie's note. The same receipts, the same leather address book, everything in the same arrangement. Now the birthday card I'd left face down was face up. The address book had been moved 2 inches to the left and set back with the spine facing the wrong direction. Someone had been through it carefully. Just not carefully enough. Carol didn't know I'd moved the letter the same evening I'd found it. It had been in my jacket pocket ever since, and then in the inside lining of the coat hanging in my closet, and she'd been looking for something that wasn't there anymore. I straightened the birthday card and closed the drawer. Then I went to bed and lay there with my eyes open until 3 in the morning. I called Eugene at 7 from the back of the yard, where the cold was clean and sharp, and nothing in the house could hear me. I told him what I needed. He didn't ask for explanations, just listened, said he understood, and gave me a name and a number before we'd been on the phone 4 minutes. Sandra Pruitt, he said. Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. She investigated a financial case out our way a few years back, an elder care situation that nobody wanted to look at. She looked at it. A brief pause. She's not the kind that backs down when someone with money starts making noise. I wrote the number on the inside of my left wrist with a ballpoint pen, the way I used to write things I couldn't afford to lose during tax season. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office sat on Outer Arsenal Street, in a building that looked like it had been designed to suggest permanence rather than comfort. Detective Sandra Pruitt met me in a small conference room off the main corridor, a space with a metal table, 4 chairs, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. She was 47, with brown hair cut in a way that suggested she'd made a decision about practicality and wasn't revisiting it. And she had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to investigators who have learned that silence draws out more truth than questions. She sat across from me, set a legal pad on the table, and said, "Go ahead, Mr. Keene." So I did. I told her everything. Not in the order it had happened, in the order it connected. The camera footage and what Serena had said on it, the forged will and the insurance policy, and Frank Culver's 7 months of quiet waiting, Greer's blood work and what it showed, and why he'd stayed silent, and the supplemental results on Maggie's sample. Bill Cantwell at the window in June, the note in the nightstand drawer, the pills that had changed color and shape, Carol and her phone, and the medicine cabinet, and the nightstand that had been gone through the previous evening. Pruitt wrote steadily throughout. She didn't interrupt, didn't react visibly, didn't offer the expressions of shock or sympathy that people sometimes use to manage the discomfort of hearing difficult things. She just listened with the focused attention of someone assembling something as the pieces came in. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "What you have is significant," she said. "The footage alone is substantial, combined with Culver's documents and Greer's records." She paused, straightening her notes. "But for an arrest that holds up completely, I want to catch her in the act. Something that removes any remaining ambiguity." I nodded. I'd expected something like that. "The woman you know as Serena Suxiter," Pruitt said, and something in the phrasing made me look up. The method here, the patience, the documentation, the layered approach, it's familiar to me in a way I want to look into. She made a note. "I'm going to run her prints tonight. I want to know exactly who we're dealing with before we move." Then she set down her pen. "Tell me everything about how Carol Deming was hired. Every detail you can remember." Carol was in the kitchen when I got home, working through the evening routine with her usual quiet efficiency. She looked up, said something pleasant about the cold, and went back to what she was doing. I hung up my coat and answered her with something equally pleasant and went to wash my hands. On the counter beside the sink, the weekly pill organizer sat in its usual place. Tonight's compartment had been refilled, the capsules lined up in their small plastic cells, pale and orderly. I picked up the organizer and looked at the contents under the kitchen light. Off-white, slightly oval. "Thank you, Carol," I said. She smiled from across the kitchen, that precisely calibrated smile arriving on schedule. "Of course, Mr. Keene." Upstairs, with the door closed and the lamp off, I stood in the dark of my bedroom and held the pill organizer in both hands. In the morning, I would call Frank. I would check in with Pruitt. I would come downstairs and have coffee and answer Carol's questions about my plans, and smile at whatever Serena said at dinner, and respond to Brandon's careful inquiries about my health with the reassurances he was expecting. I would do all of that, because I understood now, standing in the dark of the bedroom where Maggie and I had slept for 30 years, holding a box of pills I had no intention of swallowing, that every conversation in this house, every meal, every exchange at the bottom of the stairs had been a performance from the beginning. The only difference now was that I knew my lines. He showed up at the back door at 6:30 with a paper grocery bag and no explanation. That was becoming characteristic of Eugene Marsh. He arrived when something had drawn him there, offered what he'd brought, and didn't require the visit to be more than what it was. I'd stopped finding it unusual. I'd started finding it necessary. Brandon and Serena were upstairs. I could hear the low, uninflected sound of a television through the ceiling, the particular rhythm of two people in a room together who aren't really talking. I let Eugene in through the kitchen and didn't say anything about the timing, and he didn't offer any. And Cody came in behind him and walked directly to the space under the kitchen table and settled there with a long exhale, as though he'd been looking forward to this specific floor all day. He'd brought the ingredients for a bean and sausage soup, the straightforward, unambitious kind that Watertown people make in December, the sort of thing that asks nothing of you except a pot and some patience. He moved around my kitchen with the practical confidence of a man who'd been cooking for one long enough to be efficient about it. And I sat at the table and watched, and didn't tell him he didn't have to do this, because we both understood that wasn't the point. The soup took 40 minutes. We ate it at the kitchen table with the snow coming down outside the window and the overhead light keeping everything small and warm and contained. And for a little while the house felt less like the place I'd been living through and more like the place I'd actually lived. We talked about the things people talk about when they're working up to something real. The forecast. The stretch of Route 12 that flooded every January without fail. A hardware store Eugene had been going to for 20 years that was apparently under new management and wasn't the same. Small things. The conversational equivalent of clearing a table before you set it. "Tell me about Garrett," I said when the soup was half gone. Eugene set his spoon down. Not with resistance, more like a man who had been carrying something for a while and was deciding whether the moment was right to put it on the table. "He's 41, he said. "Lives out in Phoenix. Got a decent job far as I can tell. Not in any trouble." He looked at his bowl. I just decided at some point that I wasn't something he needed anymore. No argument. No falling out. Just less and less, and then nothing. Going on 4 years now. He said it the way a person describes a weather pattern factually without drama. The flatness of someone who has moved through the acute phase of something and arrived at the part that's just permanent. "I called for the first year," he said. "Left messages, sent a card at Christmas. After a while, you understand that the silence is an answer, even if it's not the kind you wanted." The kitchen clock marked a few seconds. "You know what's harder than a child hurting you," he said. "Loving them anyway. Not being able to turn it off just because it would be more convenient." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. "That night I knocked on your door," Eugene said, looking up at me. "I'd been driving around for 2 hours. Couldn't tell you why I stopped here." He paused. "Chew, I think I needed to find out if every father ends up eating Christmas dinner alone. Whether that was just how it went." Under the table, Cody shifted. "I don't know exactly when I started talking about Brandon. Not the sequence of events I delivered that to Pruitt, in the sterile clarity of a conference room with a legal pad between us. This was different. This was the part that didn't have evidence attached to it. The part that lived underneath the facts. "I keep trying to find the moment," I said. "The specific point where something changed. Where he became, I stopped, started again. Where I stopped recognizing him." Eugene didn't offer a theory. He waited. "I don't know if I failed him somewhere," I said. "Or if this was always in him and I just didn't see it. Or if somebody came along and found something in him and cultivated it." I set down my spoon. "I don't know which one is worse. Some questions don't have answers that make things better," Eugene said quietly. "They just have answers." He said it without cruelty and without comfort. As a plain fact about the way certain things were. I looked at him across the kitchen table. This man I'd known for 9 days, who had arrived in a snowstorm with a dog and no particular plan, and who had become without either of us arranging it. The closest thing I had to solid ground. It was then that Cody moved. He came out from under the table without urgency, walked the 2 steps to where I was sitting, and set his broad head on my thigh. Heavy and warm and entirely deliberate. He looked up at me with those amber eyes that always seemed to be in possession of more information than they were sharing. I put my hand on his head. It was the first time since June that I'd sat in this kitchen and not felt completely alone. My phone buzzed against the table. Pruitt. A text message, 4 lines. Got results on her prints. This is bigger than I expected. Call me immediately. Don't use the landline or your regular cell, use a different line. I read it twice. Then I looked up at Eugene, who was watching me with the steady attention of a man who had learned to read rooms. I have to make a call, I said. He nodded once. No questions. I pushed back from the table, took my coat from the hook by the back door, and stepped out into the cold dark of the December night. The snow had stopped. The air was still and sharp and full of the particular silence that follows a storm, and somewhere down County Route 202 a dog was barking at something it couldn't see. I dialed Pruitt's number and waited. I left the house at 7:30 while Carol was still upstairs. I told no one where I was going. I left a note on the kitchen counter that said errands, 1 word, the same word I'd been using as cover for the past week, and drove out through the gray December morning with the heater running and the roads still carrying the packed residue of the last snowfall. The Walmart on Outer Washington Street had a parking lot large enough that 2 vehicles sitting together in a far corner read as nothing at all. In a smaller lot, a meeting between a retired accountant and a county detective might eventually become a story. In that lot, we were just 2 people sitting in a car. Pruitt was already there when I pulled in. I got into the passenger seat of her unmarked sedan, and she handed me a cup of coffee without preamble, which I took as confirmation that she understood how the morning was going to go. The heater was running. The windows had fogged slightly at the edges. On the dashboard, a manila folder sat face down, the deliberate placement of someone who had decided on the order of operations before I arrived. She turned it over and opened it. The photograph was a standard Federal Records image, the flat, information-only quality of something taken for documentation rather than identification. A woman in her early 30s, dark hair longer than Serena wore it now. A slightly different arrangement of expression, the specific neutrality of someone managing their face for a camera they'd had practice with. The face was identical. Diana Rourke, Pruitt said. Born 1987 in Columbus, Ohio. No prior criminal record before 2018, at least nothing that was charged. She turned to the next page. In the spring of 2018, her husband, a man named Robert Ellison, passed away at their residence outside of Cleveland. He was 54. The official cause was listed as a sudden cardiac event. She gave that phrase a moment of quiet. Ellison had a significant estate property investments, a business he'd built over 20 years. Diana inherited the majority of it, totaling approximately $1.2 million. Another page. The family contested the circumstances. The local authorities opened an inquiry. Medical examiners who reviewed the case flagged inconsistencies in the post-mortem findings that were inconsistent with a straightforward cardiac event. Outside the car, a delivery truck was making its way across the far end of the parking lot, moving slowly in the cold. Before the subpoena for Diana's testimony could be formally served, she was gone. Left the property, left Ohio, left the name Diana Rourke entirely. Pruitt looked at me. She had help. Carol Briggs, her former college roommate, and based on what we now know, a long-term associate in a more operational sense, disappeared at the same time. Different directions, presumably, and then reconvened under new names. I looked at the photograph again. The same mouth, the same angle of the jaw, the composed, self-contained quality that I'd never been able to fully relax around, that Maggie had identified in one quiet sentence in our kitchen 8 years ago. She listens too carefully. Does Brandon know, I asked, who she actually is? Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Not hesitation, more like precision. Based on what we've been able to establish so far, no. We believe he genuinely thinks he married a woman named Serena. She identified him deliberately, a man with family assets and a complicated relationship with his parents the kind of situation she'd worked with before. She set the folder down. Your son made choices that caused serious harm. That's real and it won't disappear. But he was also chosen very carefully by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. I sat with that. The two things existed simultaneously and didn't cancel each other out. The man who had nodded slowly on a couch at 2 a.m, while a woman outlined the plan, and the man who had been selected years earlier by someone who had done this before and knew which people were useful. Both of those things were true. Both of them were my son. I closed my eyes for a moment. Just a moment. What do you need from me? I asked. We need her to act directly, Pruitt said, in a way that's observable and unambiguous. The footage, the documents, the medical records, they build a very strong case, but a good defense attorney introduces reasonable doubt around each piece individually. She turned slightly in the driver's seat to face me. What removes reasonable doubt is catching her in the act. Her hands on the substance. Her making the decision in real time while we're positioned to see it. She looked at me steadily. I need you to go back to that house and continue exactly as you have been. Cooperative, unaware. Give her no reason to change her timeline. A pause. Can you do that? I looked out the windshield at the gray expanse of the parking lot at the ordinary December morning, going about its business around us, cars pulling in, people moving between their vehicles and the entrance, the unremarkable machinery of a regular day. Tell me what I need to do, I said. She was already reaching for her notepad when she stopped. One more thing, she said. The compound in your blood work, the one Greer identified. She set the notepad down. We ran it against the Ohio case files. I looked at her. Mom, it's the same substance, she said. Identical compound profile. Same method of delivery, gradual, low-level, designed to present as natural cognitive decline. She held my eyes. Diana Rourke has used this before, Walter. She refined it the first time and brought it here. The car was very quiet. I thought about Robert Ellison, a man I had never met, 54 years old, who had built something over 20 years and died in his own home, and been mourned, probably, while the person responsible stood nearby and managed their expression. I thought about Maggie. I thought about Brandon sleeping in the room down the hall from a woman whose real name he had never known, who had practiced this before on another man in another state and walked away with one. $2 million and 7 years of running room. My son was in that house right now. He had done things that could not be excused. And he had no idea who he was living with. I sat in the passenger seat of Pruitt's sedan in a Walmart parking lot on a gray December morning, and I understood fully, finally, without the last remaining edge of doubt, exactly what kind of danger we were all in. Before we continue, just a quick note. Some parts of this story are enhanced with fictional elements for storytelling purposes, so they may not fully reflect real events. If you're enjoying the video, feel free to share it and subscribe to stay updated with the next stories. And if this isn't your kind of content, you're always free to stop here. Pruitt called at 2 p.m. I was in the living room with a book I hadn't been reading when the phone buzzed in my shirt pocket. The secondary cell she'd given me at our last meeting, a prepaid unit that lived at the bottom of my coat lining and that I'd been moving to my pocket each morning before Carol arrived. Tonight, Pruitt said, we have everything we need from Ohio. The warrant's been signed. A pause that carried the particular weight of someone confirming a decision that can't be reversed once spoken. 7:30 entry through the rear. You don't need to do anything except stay at the table. I said I understood. I put the phone back in my pocket and picked up my book and looked at the same paragraph I'd been looking at for 20 minutes. Tonight, the 2 days between our Walmart meeting and this one had required a kind of sustained performance I hadn't known I was capable of. I had come home from that parking lot and made dinner and asked Carol about her weekend and responded to Brandon's inquiry about whether I'd slept better with what I hoped was convincing vagueness. I had taken my place at the kitchen counter each morning and held the weekly pill organizer in my hand and looked at the off-white capsules with the expression of a man who saw nothing unusual. I palmed them, held them under my tongue, found reasons to pass through the downstairs bathroom before the first hour was up. The pill organizer count had to stay consistent. Carol checked it, so I made sure the numbers worked. One capsule down the drain, the rest accounted for. The organizer returned to its spot with the precision of someone who had spent 40 years making sure columns added up. I had eaten at the same table as the woman who had done this before, in another state to another family, and I had passed her the bread and commented on the weather. I had done it for 2 days. Tonight was the last night. Serena made roast chicken. She'd started in the early afternoon. I could hear her in the kitchen from the living room. The particular sounds of someone cooking with the unhurried attention of a person who takes satisfaction in doing things properly. The table in the dining room was set with the good placemats, the ones Maggie had bought years ago at a shop on Public Square that had long since closed. 2 candles in the center, the kind of arrangement that under any other circumstances would have looked like care. Brandon came downstairs at 6:30. He was dressed not formally, but more carefully than a Friday evening at home usually warranted. He poured himself a glass of water at the sink and stood there for a moment, looking out the window at the dark yard. And I watched him from the doorway with the objectivity of a man who has already done his grieving for a particular version of something and no longer needs to protect himself from the sight of it. He looked, I thought, like a person who had been carrying something for a long time and had stopped being able to remember what it felt like to put it down. Throughout dinner, he was quieter than usual. His phone was on his knee under the table. I could see the faint pulse of the screen in the gap between his thigh and the table edge, the small glow of someone checking something repeatedly without wanting to be seen checking. He answered questions with 2 or 3 words. He ate without tasting. He knew something was wrong. I was certain of it, not the specifics perhaps, but the general shape of it. The feeling that the walls had been moving while he wasn't looking, that the ground under the arrangement he'd agreed to was no longer as solid as advertised. He had known, I thought, for a while, and he had made his choice about what to do with that knowledge. He had looked away. Serena refilled the wine glasses halfway through the meal, mine first, with the particular attentiveness of a good host. I set my hand alongside the glass and did not lift it. "Can I get you something warmer, Dad?" she said. "Tea, maybe. Or hot water with lemon? It's what I make when the cold gets into your chest." She was already standing. "That would be fine," I said. She moved to the kitchen with the ease of someone completely confident in what they were doing and who they were doing it to. I heard the refrigerator, a drawer, the quiet sound of something being introduced to liquid, and stirred with the unhurried patience of someone who had done this before and knew that patience was what made it work. I looked at Brandon. He was looking at his plate. The candles threw uneven shadows across the table. Somewhere in the house, the furnace cycled on with its familiar low thrum. I watched my son sit in the chair he'd sat in since he was old enough to reach the table, staring at the remains of his dinner with the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he had told himself wasn't there. I thought he already knows, not what exactly, but that something was ending tonight, and that he'd had a hand in arriving here. Serena came back from the kitchen. She set the mug in front of me, white ceramic steam rising in a thin curl. She stood for a moment with both hands at her sides. Posture, easy expression, exactly as composed as it had been every day for the past 3 months. Behind her, through the kitchen window, I caught the shadow of movement in the dark of the backyard. A shape crossing from the fence line to the door. There. Then gone. I placed my hand on the mug. I did not lift it. I looked up at the woman across the table from me, at the face I now knew by 2 names, at the eyes that had watched my wife pass, and had watched me swallow things I shouldn't have, and had spent 3 months waiting for me to stop being a problem. "Diana," I said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Brandon's head came up. Serena Diana did not move, did not flinch. She held my eyes for a long moment, and then something happened in her face that I hadn't seen before. Not panic, not collapse, but a slow, deliberate release of something she'd been holding in place. Not the mask falling off. The mask being set aside, with her own hands. Deliberately. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, old man," she said, in a voice that had shed every trace of warmth. I'll admit that. The back door opened. Pruitt came through it, with 2 officers behind her, moving with the purposeful, unhurried efficiency of people who have staged this kind of entry before and know exactly where they're going. "Step away from the table," Pruitt said. Her voice was flat and entirely without theater. "Hands where I can see them." Diana looked at the officers. She looked at the mug on the table. Then she looked around the room with the calm, evaluating attention of someone taking inventory, exits, angles, options, and found what she found. And the faint smile that crossed her face afterward was not the smile of a defeated person. "There's nothing here that proves anything," she said pleasantly. "A warm drink, a family dinner." She turned to look at Brandon for the first time since Pruitt had come through the door. He was standing now, his chair pushed back his face, the face of a man who has just had the last wall come down. She looked at him, and in her eyes was something I don't think Brandon had ever seen there before in 4 years of marriage. Not anger, not calculation, just the specific blankness of a person looking at something that has served its purpose. Complete indifference. Whatever Brandon had believed about what existed between them, he saw in that moment exactly what it had been. The room went quiet in the way that rooms do after something irreversible has happened. Not empty, but settled the way air settles after a door has been shut against the wind. Pruitt's team moved with the economy of people who had done this kind of work long enough to have no wasted gestures. One officer stayed with Diana. A second moved toward the hallway and the stairs. Pruitt herself stood near the center of the room, her eyes covering the space with the practiced attention of someone mapping it in real time. The candles were still burning. Diana stood with her back straight and both hands already at her sides. Not in surrender exactly, more in the manner of someone who had run the calculation and arrived at a result. When the officer moved to her, she said 2 words. "My attorney." Then she placed her wrists together behind her back, without being asked, with the smooth, unhesitating compliance of someone for whom this motion was not entirely unfamiliar. She did not look at Brandon. The officer who had gone upstairs came back down 3 minutes later with Carol Deming ahead of him. Carol was in her cardigan, the practical navy one she wore in the evenings, and she walked down the stairs with the same composed efficiency she'd brought to everything else in this house for 3 months. When she reached the bottom and turned toward the front door, she passed within 4 feet of where I was standing. She didn't look at me. Not a deliberate avoidance, more the absence of any impulse to look the way you don't look at furniture when you pass it. I watched her go and felt something I hadn't anticipated. Not anger, not satisfaction. A kind of nausea that had nothing to do with the stomach. The particular revulsion that comes from understanding how thoroughly you were managed by someone moving through your home every day, handling your medications, asking about your appetite, smiling at exactly the right moments. 3 months, every day. The back door opened, and Eugene came in from the porch, phone in hand. He'd been out there apparently since before 7:30, positioned at the kitchen window, on the far side of the back door, in the cold December dark, watching through the glass. He found Pruitt without preamble. "She went to the sink before your team came in the front," he said. "Tried to pour something down the drain. I have the whole thing on here." He held up the phone. "Clear angle, good light from the kitchen. You can see her hands." Pruitt looked at the footage for 30 seconds, then looked at Eugene. "I'll need that phone," she said. "I figured," Eugene said and handed it over. He looked at me across the room. I nodded once. He nodded back. There was nothing else that needed to be said between us, and we both understood that. Brandon hadn't moved from the corner of the room. He wasn't restrained, no one had approached him yet, which I understood was a deliberate decision on Pruitt's part. He stood with his back against the wall and his arms at his sides, and watched the organized departure of everything he'd been part of with the specific stillness of a man who has just seen the architecture of his own life from the outside for the first time. When the front door closed behind Diana and the officer, Brandon, turned to look at it, he stood there looking at the closed door for a moment. Then very quietly, in a voice that I had to tilt toward him to catch, "Did she ever—" He stopped, tried again. Was any of it real? Any part of it? Was there anything that was actually— He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Outside, a car engine turned over. Headlights swept across the front window and moved away down County Route 202. The sound receded and then was gone. Brandon received his answer in that silence. He moved to the dining chair, not the one he'd been sitting in, at dinner the one beside it, and sat down without being asked, without looking at anyone. And then, with the absence of self-consciousness that only comes when a person has gone past the point where appearances mean anything, he put his face in his hands. Not the performance of grief, the thing itself. I had been bracing myself, I realized, for anger. For the particular fury of a man caught the deflection and the accusations and the noise that people sometimes make when the walls come down. I had prepared myself for that version of my son. I was not prepared for this one. He wasn't crying for the arrest. I understood that without needing to be told. He was crying because he had spent 4 years loving a fiction, had handed his mother's life over to support a plan he hadn't had the courage to examine, and was sitting in the house he'd grown up in with the full weight of what that meant landing on him for the first time, without anything to put between himself and it. Pruitt appeared at my shoulder. She raised her eyebrows, a question. I shook my head. 1 minute. She stepped back toward the kitchen. The room was very quiet. The candles had burned lower. Outside, the snow had started again. I could see it in the amber glow of the porch light through the dining room window coming down with the patient. Indifferent steadiness of weather that doesn't concern itself with what's happening inside the houses it falls on. Under the table, Cody shifted. He came out, slowly walked past the empty chairs, and lay down across my feet with the settled, deliberate weight of an animal that has decided this is exactly where it needs to be. I looked at my son. I thought about the photograph on the wall in the living room, the 7-year-old at the edge of Black Lake, gap-toothed, triumphant, holding up a fish with both hands. I thought about the man who had sat on this same couch at 2 in the morning and nodded while someone described what they were going to do to me. Both of those people were real. I stood up and walked to the hallway and opened the front door for Pruitt. I did not say anything to Brandon as I passed him. Not because there was nothing to say, because there was too much, and none of it belonged in a cold room on a December night with strangers present and the door still open. Some things require time to become words. They walked Brandon out at 8:45. At the threshold he stopped. He turned and looked back at me across the length of the room, the dining table between us, the burned-down candles, the remains of a dinner nobody had finished. He didn't say anything, neither did I. We just looked at each other. Cody sat beside my feet and watched Brandon go tail still the way he watched everything that mattered completely and without looking away. The door closed. The house settled back into its particular silence, and the snow came down outside the windows, and I stood in the hallway of the house I'd built and breathed. Culver called on the morning of the 15th. 3 days had passed since the night the officers walked Brandon out of the house. 3 days of a particular silence, not the hollow silence of the months before, but something different, heavier in some ways, cleaner in others. The silence of a house where the pretending had finally stopped. I asked Culver if I could bring someone. He said, of course. Eugene drove. He didn't ask why I'd called him instead of going alone, and I didn't explain, and both of us understood that the explanation wasn't necessary. Cody rode in the back seat with his chin on the center console between us, watching the road with the focused serenity he brought to most things. The drive into town took 12 minutes. Neither of us spoke. The snow was light and purposeless, the kind that drifts without accumulating just enough to soften the edges of everything. Culver was waiting when we came in. He shook my hand, nodded to Eugene, and led us back to his office without small talk, which was exactly right. Ruth, his assistant, had left coffee on the credenza. Cody settled under my chair without being asked, his warm weight pressing against my feet through the thin soles of my shoes. The envelope was already on the desk, same ivory color, same handwriting on the front. I'd been carrying it for 10 days in the inside pocket of my jacket, unopened. Present a thing I'd known I needed to read and hadn't been able to make myself face alone. Culver looked at me. "Would you like to read it out loud?" I said. "Please." He nodded. Picked up the envelope. Opened it with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood what he was holding, and unfolded the pages inside. Maggie's handwriting covered 2 full pages. The hand was unsteady in places, the particular unevenness of someone writing while frightened or in pain or both. But the sentences were clear. She had known exactly what she wanted to say, and she had said it. She had understood what was happening to her for approximately 2 weeks before the end. Not the full shape of it, not names, not the complete mechanism, but enough. She'd noticed things, the way certain symptoms appeared and disappeared in patterns she couldn't account for the timing of them in relation to meals and medications. And one evening in late May, when she'd overheard a conversation that had removed the last of her doubt. She had not told me. Culver's voice was steady as he read, but careful, the voice of a man carrying something fragile across a room. She hadn't told me because she knew me. 40 years of knowing a person gives you a precise map of what they can bear and how they bear it. And she had understood that if I learned the truth, then before there was any evidence, before there was any path forward, I would confront Brandon immediately. And if that happened, there would be nothing to hold the situation in place. No documentation, no witness, no case. And afterward, when it was my word against theirs, I would be left alone with the knowledge and none of the protection. So she had done what she could do. She had come to Culver. She had updated the will, removing Brandon as beneficiary, redirecting everything she had the authority to redirect. She had written down what she knew and what she suspected and sealed it in an envelope and told Culver the conditions under which it should be opened. She had written the note I'd found in the nightstand drawer and hidden it where she believed I would eventually look, and then she had run out of time. "I don't want you to hate him." Culver read, and his voice shifted almost imperceptibly on the words, the slight modulation of a man reading something he knows is about to matter. "Brandon is not a monster. He is a man who made a terrible choice and kept making it because he didn't know how to stop. The cruelty in this, the real cruelty, belongs to her. She found something in him that was already broken, and she used it. I have no forgiveness for her. But Brandon is still our son, Walter. Whatever he did, he is still the boy in the photograph by the lake. There is a dog. I don't know his name or where he is, but I believe he will find his way to you the way good things eventually do if you leave the door open for them. Trust him. He knows more than he can say. I love you." There has not been a single day of the 42 years without that love. Not one. Maggie. Culver set the letter down. The office was completely quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight and texture. The quiet that settles into a room when something true has just been said and everyone in it understands that speaking would only diminish it. Eugene's hand came to rest on my shoulder. Light. Steady. The hand of a man who had been sitting with his own version of an unanswerable grief long enough to know what it felt like from the inside, and who understood that nothing he said would improve upon the simple fact of being present. He didn't say a word. I looked down at Cody. He was watching me from under the chair with those amber eyes, the same patient, complete attention he'd given everything since the night he'd walked through my front door in the snow. "She knew about you," I said quietly. His tail moved. Once. A single unhurried arc. I looked at Culver. "Was she frightened?" I asked. At the end, was she in pain? Culver was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a man selecting his words with great care. "She was frightened," he said. "Yes. But every time I spoke with her, every time she came in, every phone call in those last weeks, she was thinking about you. What would happen to you? Whether you would be all right?" He paused. "She wasn't thinking about herself, Walter. That was not where her mind went." I didn't answer. I picked up the letter from the desk and folded it along its original creases and placed it in the inside pocket of my jacket, the same pocket where it had ridden for 10 days against my ribs, waiting. It settled there like something that had found its place. I sat in the car outside Culver's office for a long time after Eugene had gone back inside to retrieve Cody's leash. The street outside was ordinary people going about their Monday morning business. A truck making a delivery to the hardware store across the way. 2 women talking on the sidewalk in front of the pharmacy. The ordinary life of a small city continuing as it does without particular regard for what had happened inside any given building. I took out my phone. Jefferson County Correctional Facility allowed short messages to inmates through an approved portal Culver had walked me through, setting it up the previous day. I opened it now and found Brandon's name in the system. I looked at the blank message field for a long time. Then I typed slowly with the deliberateness of someone who understands that certain words once sent become permanent. "I got your mother's letter." 4 words. Not forgiveness. Not accusation. Not the beginning of a conversation or the end of one. Just the plain statement of a fact that I needed him to know that she had written to him too in her way, and that I had heard her. I set the phone on the passenger seat. Outside, the snow had stopped. The clouds were thinning at the edges in the way that sometimes in December in Watertown preceded an hour of pale winter light. I watched the street and felt the weight of the letter in my jacket and tried to identify what I was feeling. I couldn't find a single name for it. Perhaps that was correct. Perhaps what I was feeling was simply too large and too layered for one word to cover grief and relief and love and loss and the particular exhaustion of a man who has been holding himself together through something enormous and is only now sitting in a cold car on an ordinary street allowing himself to understand that it's over. The light changed. I started the engine. Spring came late to Watertown that year. The snow held on through February and into March, gray and stubborn, piled along the edges of every road and sidewalk in the particular way of lake-effect winters that don't know when to let go. I understood that feeling completely. The trial ran 4 days in February. The prosecution presented the camera footage, Eugene's video from the back porch, Greer's toxicology records, Culver's documentation of the forged will and the altered insurance beneficiary, and the Ohio case files linking Diana Rourke's methods across 2 states and 7 years. Carol Deming had entered a plea agreement in January, reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation. Her testimony confirmed every detail of the plan, when it had started, how it had been executed, and who had directed each step. There were no gaps left in the evidence. Diana's defense made the arguments that defenses make, and none of them found purchase. Diana Rourke was convicted on all counts, first-degree charges. In Maggie's case, attempted charges in mine fraud, document falsification, and the federal counts carried over from Ohio. The judge sentenced her to life with no possibility of early release for the primary charge, with additional concurrent sentences for the remaining counts. She received the verdict with the same composed expression she'd worn at my dinner table. She did not look at me when it was read. Brandon had entered a guilty plea in December, cooperating fully with the prosecution, the judge noted in his remarks. Before sentencing the systematic nature of the manipulation Brandon had been subjected to over 4 years, not as an excuse, but as context. He sentenced Brandon to 12 years with eligibility for review after 8 contingent on continued cooperation and demonstrated progress. When the judge asked if I wished to make a victim statement, I stood up. I had not prepared anything written. I'd thought about what I wanted to say for 6 weeks, and in the end, it came down to one sentence. "I hope my son finds his way back to himself," I said. Then I sat down. Diana across the courtroom turned to look at me. I kept my eyes on the front of the room and did not return the look. There was nothing I wanted to give her. Not anger, not acknowledgement, not even the small satisfaction of knowing she'd gotten to me. Some people don't deserve the weight of your attention. I kept the house. The decision hadn't required much deliberation. Whatever had happened inside those walls, it was still the place where Maggie had hung curtains and recovered chair cushions and stood at the kitchen window on winter mornings watching the yard disappear under snow. Those things didn't leave with everything else. They stayed in the wood and the walls and the particular quality of afternoon light that came through the south-facing windows in a way I'd never seen replicated anywhere else. I painted Brandon's home office in the first week of January. Bright white, the kind of color that makes a room feel like it's been opened to the outside. I changed every lock in the house. I put Maggie's cardinal mug back in its spot on the shelf above the stove and stopped pretending I was going to move it. Slowly, carefully, I began making the house mine again. Eugene stayed. He'd said just until spring, when he brought his second bag of clothes over in late December, and we'd both understood that the phrase didn't carry a specific expiration date. He made coffee every morning before I came downstairs, strong the way I'd mentioned once in passing that I preferred it in the afternoons, and which he'd apparently filed away and applied universally without comment. Cody slept under the kitchen table. Every evening without fail, he would make his way to the corner by the refrigerator, lower himself down beside the old white porcelain bowl, and rest his chin on the tile. He never tried to move it. He never paid it the anxious attention of an animal that doesn't know what a thing means. He simply kept it company in the patient way he kept company with most things that mattered. Bill Cantwell came by every week. He never stayed long. He'd not come in, leave something on the counter, a container of soup, a box of the oatmeal cookies he'd been making from the same recipe for 30 years, and sit for 20 minutes at the kitchen table before finding a reason to get back to his own place. We didn't discuss the June night again. We didn't need to. His presence, regular and unpretentious, was the only apology that was ever going to mean anything, and he seemed to understand that, and I did too. The letter came on a Wednesday in early March. White envelope, Brandon's handwriting on the front. Unsteady in a way I recognized from Maggie's letter. The hand of someone writing something they don't know how to write, pressing harder than necessary to make the words come out right. 1 page, 3 lines. "I'm sorry, Dad, for all of it. I don't expect anything." I sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. Then I folded it and opened the drawer beside the stove. The same drawer where I'd put Maggie's partial note after the night I found it, and where her full letter now rested in its ivory envelope, and where I'd placed the photograph of Brandon at 7 years old that I'd taken down from the hall wall the previous week. I put Brandon's letter in with the rest and closed the drawer. Then I sat there for a while with my coffee and the particular quality of a March morning in Watertown, the light coming in at a new angle, the snow on the back fence thinner than it had been, the yard showing the first gray-brown patches of ground that had been buried since December. I took the letter back out, turned it over to the blank side, and I wrote, "Cody knocked over my coffee this morning. Reminded me of you at 7 with that fish tank. I don't have much to say yet, but I'll write again next week." I sealed it, wrote the facility address on the front, set it on the table beside my mug. Eugene was at the sink with his back to me, rinsing the breakfast dishes, humming something low and tuneless the way he did when he'd settled into a morning. Cody lifted his head from under the table and looked at the envelope on the counter, then looked at me, then set his chin back on his paws, with the unhurried acceptance of an animal that understands, in its own way, that things are moving in the right direction. Outside, a bird landed on the back fence, a small one, dark-capped, quick-eyed, turning its head with the sharp alertness of something that has just arrived somewhere after a long journey and is deciding whether to stay. Maggie had been right. Every winter ends, even the ones that don't seem to know how. Even this one. If you've stayed with me this long, then you've heard the whole of it. This is my family story, not a proud one, not a clean one, but a true one. And the first thing I want to say, looking back on all of it, is this: don't be like me. Don't be the man who signs documents without reading them because he's too tired to be suspicious of his own child. Don't be the man who notices the pills have changed color and tells himself it's probably nothing. Don't be the man who sits beside his wife's bed while she's trying to warn him and doesn't lean close enough to hear. I thought love was the same thing as trust. I thought being a good father meant believing the best of my son no matter what. What I know now, what this family story cost me to learn, is that love without clear eyes isn't protection. It's just a door left open. I've sat with that regret every day since December. But here's what I've also come to understand. In the months since the snow finally melted, regret is only useful if it teaches you something. Mine taught me to pay attention to the people around me, to the small things that don't add up to the quiet voice that says something isn't right. The one I silenced for months because I wasn't ready to hear the answer. These grandpa stories, the ones nobody thinks will happen to them, they happen in ordinary houses, on ordinary streets, to ordinary men who simply loved their families and stopped watching carefully. I was one of those men. I believe God put Eugene and Cody on my porch that December night for a reason. Not because I deserved it, but because grace doesn't wait for you to deserve it. It just arrives sometimes in the middle of a snowstorm in the form of an old man and a dog who knows more than he should. If this grandpa story resonates with you, if you recognize something in it, if someone comes to mind while you are listening, pay attention to that feeling. Don't wait until the evidence is undeniable. Trust what you notice, and hold the people you love a little closer tonight. While you still can. Thank you for walking this road with me all the way to the end. If this family story moved something in, you drop a comment and tell me what would you have done in Walter's position. I genuinely want to hear how you see it. If these kinds of grandpa stories are what you come here for, consider subscribing so you never miss the next one. A small note: while rooted in real human experiences and social themes, certain elements of this story have been dramatized for narrative purposes. If this style of storytelling isn't your thing, no hard feelings, there's plenty more to explore.